Now this is a paper I have presented another conference before, so some of you may be familiar with it, but since then we've added a lot of data and we're trying to do some more modelling with this paper. But I'm working with David Reeve of NUS Business School in Singapore, and here at Monash University in Malaysia is keeping us pretty busy. Now, scams and financial fraud, we can ask questions afterwards about the nomenclature that we're using here. It probably depends on which journal you're going to send it to. But why is this a problem? Well, I think we all saw this as a huge problem, because when we had lockdowns in 2020, 2021, suddenly there were a lot of poor quality masks being shipped to governments around the world. Now, this is not me beating up on China. I love China. I've lived in China for 20 years. But this is a problem with a lot of developing economies, with factories improving their quality. And a big message we come out and talk about later is about just the need to go and visit the factory and make sure you get what you're paying for. But what the objective function that we're focusing on here is the strategic opportunism of a supplier. Now let's talk about the problems with this paper before we talk about the motivations. Is that what we've got data on over thousands of complaints that buyers have submitted to a website called supplierblacklist.com, and that was set up by an associate of mine in Hong Kong many years ago, over 10 years ago. And so we've got these complaints, and so if you look at the data, immediately you'll think, okay, is there any record of good suppliers in that complaint list? Well, not really. It's really, you've got bad suppliers and you've got very bad suppliers. So our objective function, or the dependent variable, is we're trying to predict the likelihood that the complaint is a financial fraud, a financial scam, and that's different from complaints about a quality problem, a contract problem, a missed delivery, or something like that. That can be rectified, and the buyer cannot. The buyer can get their money back, or things go on, which is normal in an ordinary case of dealing with emerging economy factories. Right, getting back to the theory, where does this fit into the literature? Well, traditionally, the literature is focused on the developmental side of managing the supplier relationship. We all know the work of Shannon Anderson, Henry Decker, one of the leaders in this field, in talking about, okay, if we want to manage suppliers over the long term, then we need to have the right governance mechanisms in place. But very little of the literature talks about, okay, how do we set up the right selection mechanisms to know that we've got the right supplier to begin with? And then on top of that, to add to the problem of the selection problem, which is what about the small buyer? What about the SME buyer? What about the buyers that are power sellers on Amazon or eBay or Lazada? Every one of us are consumers at the other end. You know what it's like if you get something that doesn't work. But the buyers are the importers of record into Australia, into the US, into the country where they're selling. And so the heat is on them, not the supplier, if something goes wrong. So this is a very real problem because of the age of electronic commerce, because of the lockdowns. Everyone's just buying more stuff online. Buyers have been making lots of money, except for when they run into these problems. And these are financial scams. What am I talking about? I'm talking about scams where you can go to a website and see something like this, and you think, wow, a tri motorbike for $200 US. Yes, I'm not kidding. This is actually true. But at the same time, if you don't like that, they'll sell you a Segway or a snowmobile or a trek bike. That's an obvious scam, because very few factories can make all of these products. And if it's an agent, it's not true that they could sell something like this for $200. Go dig even further, and you've got this factory that can make all of these products. That will never happen for a genuine factory that's making best products in the world. And so if you dig even further and you do your due diligence, remember, this is for we're talking to buyer pallet power sellers here on Amazon, and a lot of them are inexperienced, and they will go to a website and think, oh, they've got 80 to 99 people, QC staff, but in total, they've only got a couple of hundred people in the factory. That will never happen in a factory. At a factory of 5,000 square meters, not on your life, especially in these industrial buildings in emerging economies, and never ever pay Western Union. Okay, enough of my speaking to the industry and queuing you up on what to look for a scam. Let's have a look at the data. Well, just finally, you've got different scams where you pay the deposit and nothing gets shipped, or you pay the deposit and they ship you a box of rocks, and that has happened. Acquaintance of mine received a shipment of power banks, 10,000 milliamp hour power banks, and inside were cavities filled with sand, and they only put 5,000 milliamp hour cells inside so the supplier could make more money. And the buyer only found out when customers complained that the power bank didn't last long enough. Now, before you start looking at your power banks now, just pay attention to the rest of my presentation. All right, so there are other scams here, and in terms of milking the cow, asking for extra stuff and so forth. But getting on to the data and the theory and the data. Remember, I told you right from the beginning, this is a small buyer problem because generally they lack the experience and they lack the resources. So we go into the theory of theorizing why is this. If it's a small buyer, then what's the theory that you're bringing out? Is it transaction cost theory or social exchange theory, which actually brings in notions of the lesser power that a small buyer would have in actually negotiating a good deal or selecting the right supplier to begin with. All right. So a model may look like this. That is, if you have a small buyer where we're picking out their major characteristics of experience and their resources, then obviously that's going to impact on the extent that they can do screening or an in-house audit or formal audits or resolution. Now, these are all supplier selection mechanisms. These are not supplier management mechanisms that are in enduring relationships, that go on and on and on. All right, this is getting the supplier right at the get-go, and then at the end your model may look like supplier financial fraud. What I'm about to show you now is actually the data that pieces this framework together. And now I don't have a beautiful structural equation model here to show the magic of my prowess here. I'm just going to show you some basic regressions that show you different parts of this model. But before I do that, this is what the data that we've picked up, and that is when the buyer's complaint, generally they're asked questions about whether they verified the business license, did they get references, did they have a third-party visit, did they visit the factory themselves? You couldn't do that in 2020, 2021. And actually now, if you want to do 1 week quarantine in China, you can go across the border and visit the factory. And other countries too have their own constraints on visiting factories now as well. The resolution mechanisms like we call contracts and contingency payments, that is, 30, 40, 30. We will pay 30% up front, 40% when you bring to FOB port, and 30% in my own country. All right, so there's all these different ways in which buyers can go through the selection process of suppliers to make sure that they are getting the suppliers aligned with their purchase order. So we have various questions. That is, does the more use of these selection mechanisms by the buyer this incidence of the financial fraud? Okay, so in other words, we've basically got a 0-1 logistical regression here. In other words, we're trying to predict out of all of the bad suppliers that have been complained about, the ones are given to those where buyers lost money. The zeros are given to, well, it's just a quality problem or a delivery problem or a customs problem, something that can be resolved through, a bit more of a time and negotiations. So question one, if the buyer does more of these mechanisms, is the instance of the scam less? Question two, do governance practices matter alongside contracts? So in some ways, this is kind of like a complementarity type theory. That is, if you have contracts in place, does it make other mechanisms more or less effective, or do they work better as a package? And number three, initial order versus repeat order. As I said right at the start, initial order is like a low experience buyer versus repeat order, high experience, and OECD versus non-OECD buyer effects. All right. And so what we find here is, and there's some of the data, we've got a whole heap of household goods, electronic goods, industrial, office components. We've got a range of provinces of where the factories were located in China. By the way, there were complaints by other countries all over the world. This is not a beating up on a China story here. All right, stage of the relationship, most of them were initial order, and the experience, a lot of the buyers, 38%, is the first time experience in buying. Formal contract, 77% had a formal contract, and no, 83% of the buyers did not visit the production site. Yes, as much as we give that advice, they still don't do it. Business license was accurate in 85% of the cases, no, and then the level of independent quality control taking place. At 58%, no independent QC took place. Let's have a look at some of the results, and then we will finish up. All right, as you can see, what we tried to do is just do a plain regression on all of the different screening mechanisms buyers can use, and we find that verified business, the buyer visit, FOB Incoterms, contracts, if they're all in place at the screening stage, then the incidence of confronting a financial fraud, financial scam, is significantly less. Now, some of you will say, well, why don't you factor analyze this? Are there different parts? Yes, we can do a factor analysis, and we get similar results out of the result of the factor analysis. Now, just filling out that big model I was talking about at the beginning, that's the end part, where do the governance mechanisms reduce the incidence of a bad outcome, the fraud? All right. Then the next part of that model is, what about buyer characteristics? Is that related to the greater use of these mechanisms? And that's what this results are saying here, that the initial order is highly negative related to the use of these mechanisms. The value of the order, which we put down as the resources that a buyer may have, is significantly positively related to these mechanisms. So filling out that you have 2 minutes remaining. Excellent, great. And then, so this is the model that we are painting with the data at this exploratory stage. And so what we're trying to do is shed light on the economic effect of various governance mechanisms, because traditionally a lot of researchers have used a Likert scale or qualitative analysis to understand or get that idea of that objective function. Measuring fraud, measuring the incidence of fraud, is a very difficult thing to do. Next, there's a lot of analytical literature on this area where they actually talk about how to optimize the selection and development stages of managing suppliers. And we use data of actual contract violations. So, and we've got the gamut of very low violation where it's just a missed delivery, poor quality, but very high extreme violation, which we call financial fraud. That is, you lost your money and you cannot find and contact the supplier. So I just appreciate comments, feedback in this ongoing development of this project. Thank you, Carla.